Hello, Madhav.
Hi Vedant.
क्या हाल है? Okay. Thank you for joining me on this podcast. Madhav is officially the third guest of this podcast, which hopefully thousands of people are watching. How did I meet Madhav? I don't even remember. कैसे मिले थे हम?
I remember I ran into you in the library cafe. You asked me what I do, and as always, I advertise for the archives. That's what I end up doing to all first year undergraduate students. I hope I'm not doing the same for UG 28. By the time, I hope before that, I'm able to find a grad school which is willing to take me.
With that said, you have already been to grad school, so I'm hopeful for your grad school prospects, your PhD. But as you said, you work in the archive department. So for those watching, this conversation is going to be revolve around college, how to make the most out of your undergraduate years, how to get the most out of graduate school, social anxiety, which a lot of youngsters today seem to deal with, including myself sometimes, and just about Gandhi, because he's a pretty interesting character, and Madhav knows a lot about Gandhi, so we're gonna dive into that as well. So let's start with the college. So Madhav, you began your studies in Hindu college
Yes.
at Delhi University, and you BA'd in history.
Yeah.
Now the thing is, most students in India, at least the sane ones, they choose engineering, which is to say, it's still looked down upon to major in the arts, that people say, because it's not employable. At least that's what they claim. It doesn't teach you real practical skills which will help you earn money. Now, of course, that's a myth, because we see countless examples of people majoring in these subjects and not just earning a lot, but leading a fulfilling life, which is ultimately the purpose of whatever we're doing here, right? So I think just to take that bold of a decision, so a lot of students watch. So I've had a lot of conversations on campus with students where they're nervous to major in their area of interest, just because they think they won't earn money or they won't be financially stable. And so what was that a worry for you? Employability, or not finding a job after college, or just the fact that history is looked down upon by other people?
I think to begin with, I was never very good at thinking about practical questions. And maybe that's why I'm here in the first place. But on a more serious note, I think there was a very supportive environment at home. My own father was a professor of English literature at Punjab University.
Mm-hmm.
And so I grew up in an environment where reading was encouraged. There were a lot of resources for reading. I remember there were 6-7 newspapers that used to come at home. I had access to good journals like the Economic and Political Weekly and Frontline. There was a huge library that I had at home, and you could, dip into perhaps whatever your interest was. Whether it was philosophy, whether it was literature, whether it was history. And I remember my father getting me Ranajit Guha's Small Voice of History when I was in 12th grade. So he saw that I was inclined, or I liked the subject, and he encouraged that interest as well.
Uh-huh.
And the first time I really fell in love with Cleo, who happens to be the goddess of history, is when I read this very seminal text by E.H. Carr called What is History? And that, more than being a text on history, because see, most people's entry point into history is stories about the past, reading about kings and queens and battles, maybe. Although that notion of history has undergone a dramatic change.
Right.
But it was a text about the philosophy of history,
As in how do you approach history?
It was a text about whether history as a discipline can make truth claim. What is the nature of historical knowledge?
Interesting.
And that really got me fascinated. And I thought, here are questions that can preoccupy me for a long time, I remember sitting down with that book and taking copious notes as a 16-year-old. And that was a big deal for a 16-year-old, And so I thought, this is a subject worth studying. I never thought whether I'd get anything in return, whether I'd end up as a, big shot historian, or if I'd have enough money to sustain myself. The idea was that here is something which really fascinates me, and I must study it. That was the impulse.
So just the curiosity that you got from it, or that you had for history, made you pursue the field.
That's true. The curiosity, and as a 5-year-old once told me, this 5-year-old who was then 5-year-old.
He's not still 5.
He's not still
Yes.
5. Yes.
15 सालों से 5 years.
So he once said something remarkable. He said, Madhav, curiosity is the driver of knowledge. And that statement, stayed with me for quite some time. And I feel, if there are questions which really preoccupy you, which questions to which you can devote hours and hours thinking about them, reading about them, refining them, then I think there's something there which perhaps which needs further nurturing.
Yeah.
And it's that essentially that I have tried to do throughout my engagement with the discipline over the years while studying it as well. I've engaged with allied fields of history, museums, and heritage management, and now I'm working in the archives. So I think exploring the different facets of history as a discipline is what kind of fascinates me. I have my own kind of choices as far as the fields and the periods of history that I'm that interest me, but that's a separate conversation.
Mm-hmm. I think a lot of people who either study history or are planning on studying history have a lot of misconceptions about what history is and what majoring in history can look like. As I'm sure when you read that book and then you went off to college, you're like, there may have been some courses that are like, this isn't exactly what I want to focus on right now. I want to focus on this aspect of history. But you can't do that because you're in a fixed curriculum, following a fixed curriculum. So for those, actually it reminds me of a quote by Edgar Dijkstra. He's a Dutch computer scientist. And the quote is something along those lines of, computer science is as much about computers as astronomy is about telescopes. So you're confusing the field for its tools. And I'm sure in the case of history, there are a bunch of misconceptions that students have. That history is about X or it's about Y, it's about dates, it's about figures, it's about scavenging. I don't know. Maybe that's a misconception. So I think for those who are planning on majoring in history, what would you wish they know before they make that decision?
That's a very good question. I think suggest, this is a very generic suggestion, not a very specific one, but I would suggest that a student who's perhaps in high school and would like to take history up for honors and further should read as widely as possible, read as many different kinds of history as possible. So let's say if political history appeals to you, try reading social history, the history of workers and peasants. If you're an Indian history person, try reading about the history of Africa. If you're fascinated by ancient Indian history, perhaps, then try reading a bit about archaeology and epigraphy.
What's epigraphy?
Epigraphy is a study of inscriptions.
Okay.
Yeah.
Inscriptions. Okay.
Yeah. So try reading as widely as possible, because history, I think, above all else, is also encountering that which is not familiar. It's encountering the unfamiliar. And therefore, familiarizing yourself with multiple histories is the best way of nurturing that historical imagination, if I can use that word. So I think that would be one. Second advice would be
exploring different kinds of history.
Second would be try learning different languages, right? Because as you pursue history, especially at the postgraduate level or at the research level, you'd realize that you encounter sources in different languages depending on the period that you're working in. If you're working on ancient Indian history, then Sanskrit becomes important. If you're working on medieval history, then Persian is important. And some historians are brave enough to even learn European languages. So the earlier you start this language learning process, the better equipped you'd be, to handle sources in different languages.
Right. And this comes in play during graduate work, usually, I'm assuming.
Yes, during your
the use of
master's or even your MPhil or PhD. MPhil has become defunct now.
Yeah.
But especially during your PhD, it's essential during your PhD to conduct archival research and consult sources in multiple languages.
In fact, when I arrived on campus a couple of weeks ago, I was talking to Madhav and he's like, do you know anyone who speaks Punjabi? Because you needed to decode a couple of
Yes.
I don't know exactly what you were.
Yeah, there is a transcription project which requires listening to interviews in Punjabi and transcribing them.
Yeah.
So there again, language comes into the picture.
Exactly.
Because history speaks in different languages,
Uh-huh.
And I think that also teaches you something else, something remarkable, that uh, the fact that history speaks in so many different voices and in so many different languages is perhaps antithetical to very homogeneous ways of thinking, by which I mean, we often tend to prioritize, we often think that history should serve certain nationalistic purposes, my nation's history, and uh, my nation had a glorious civilizational history, or it was the best, or whatever.
Yeah.
I think history humbles us by forcing us to think in diverse, distinct ways. So I think that's also another aspect that I'd like to flag, perhaps, for your audience.
Are you thinking about, do you have a particular experience in mind where history humbled you? Or are you talking about, or did you say that like generally?
I was making more of a general point, but I think this is a point that the historian Ramachandra Guha also makes in this brilliant essay which is called History Sans Chauvinism.
She shuns chauvinism.
History without chauvinism.
History without chauvinism.
History without chauvinism. And he kind of emphasizes this point: a pluralism in methodology, a pluralism when it comes to sources.
So having multiple sources, having multiple methodologies,
sources, having multiple methodologies, and also the point that I made about languages as well, kind of makes you realize that history is very ill-suited for chauvinistic purposes, for xenophobic purposes. Think of today, when there's all sorts of talk on social media about how we were great, and foreigners kind of sullied our civilization. And we must somehow bring in legislations which expels foreigners. It's been our experience, it's been this nation's experience, or the civilization's experience, that we've also been enriched by, people from different faiths and different cultures coming in. So, and we can't neglect those aspects of our history as well, right? So I think that's something that we must keep in mind. That history does not lend itself to chest thumping.
What does that mean? Oh, literally.
Yeah. So, it's more complex, it's more nuanced, and it does not lend itself to the kind of crude nationalism that some people would wish that it lend itself to.
That's simply cherry picking, right? In that sense. I mean, I think in all histories, you'll find moments of greatness and just moments of tragedies committed by the same group of people. So you can't claim that this group is the best, this group is the worst or something. But it's way more complicated than that.
Yeah.